Good morning and welcome to Climate Matters, your monthly sustainability radio show brought to you by the City of Santa Fe Environmental Services Division. I'm your host, Neil Denton. I'm the Sustainability Officer for the city. And for the next half hour, we're going to be talking about COP26, the upcoming Conference of Parties convened by the United Nations in Glasgow, Scotland, for people to come together from all over the world leaders and others, to discuss what we're going to do about climate change. And for that discussion, I'm joined by Gary Payton. Gary is the Research and Technical Advisor with the Coalition of Sustainable Communities, New Mexico. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning, Neil. Thank you very much for having me on your program again.
Thanks for joining me. It sounds like you know a good bit about the United Nations efforts to combat climate change. So thanks for being my guest.
Thank you very much. I had the pleasure in 2015 to be an official observer at COP21 in Paris, the important coalition of the Conference of the Parties 21 that brought together over 195 nations from around the world to reach the very important Paris Agreement. And for those of us here in New Mexico, many of our cities and counties and the state itself have sought across these last few years to be able to make a path toward the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
And that Paris Agreement, that was approved by every nation in the world in 2015. Is that right? Did I get that right?
That's correct. It was really been an extraordinary event. It brought together the leaders of over 195 different countries from around the world. What was important on the initial day there in early November 2015 was that there were 150 presidents and prime ministers and royal leaders from around the world, the largest single gathering of senior leadership around a single topic for the planet in the history of humanity. It was an extraordinary event.
Agreed. And they all agreed to create plans and strategies to limit greenhouse gas emissions so that the mean temperature of the world does not exceed 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with the better goal being 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees Celsius is really the tipping point for things getting pretty bad, from the sea level rising to an increase in the intensity of hurricanes and forest fires. Do you know how they, or do you want to speak some to how they reached that point of 2 degrees Celsius, the work that's gone into that?
Well, as we look back upon this process that the United Nations has been engaged in, it really all began with a Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Across the course of multiple years and multiple COP gatherings, there had been fits and starts in terms of progress. Perhaps the low point was the Conference of the Parties that was held in Copenhagen in 2011. So leaders got together, negotiators got together and realized that they needed an improved process. So with the increased scientific awareness of the impact of the climate crisis, increased citizen pressure from around the world, it created the conditions for the Paris Agreement to move forward. And indeed, it was at that low point in 2011 that the leaders did say that we should set a global goal of not exceeding 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase. And I think it's important for all of us, particularly here in the United States, who are more familiar with the Fahrenheit scale, to kind of do the little translation. So when we're talking about 2 degrees C, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 4 degrees. So it's important to kind of bear that in mind, because I think we can be kind of lulled into thinking it's smaller when we really deal with just the Celsius scale.
Right. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So what's going to happen at COP26?
Well, there's been really a rather extraordinary progression over the course of these last 6 years. Indeed, COP26 was scheduled to take place last November, but because of COVID, the national communities recognized that it needed to be delayed. But over the course of these intervening period, there's really been some substantial changes. On the one hand, The science is much more granular. The science is much more improved, indeed pointing out extraordinary urgency. So just this last August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of international climate scientists, came out with the most dramatic report to date dealing with the circumstance that the global community is now in. They indicated that if we maintain the path that we are on right now in terms of global emissions, that we'll clearly pass through that 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius within the next 2 decades. The Secretary General of the United Nations said this is code red for the planet. The senior advisor to the president, the special advisor for climate matters, John Kerry, called for overwhelming urgency. So behind this COP is the greater scientific urgency for coming to improved solutions and improved plans by the nations. But I think there's also been some very other important actions that have changed the circumstance from 2015 to 2021. Like we can all think back over the last couple of years when Greta Thunberg was able to mobilize youth from around the world,
Right.
an extraordinary outpouring here in Santa Fe, across New Mexico, across the world, of young adults who were calling upon leaders not to mortgage their future. So the climate, the circumstance leading up to this is a much more focused and dire circumstance than we had even in 2015.
Yeah, I understand. Basically, if some serious commitments are not reached at this conference, we're basically out of time to reach that goal of 2 degrees Celsius. If depending on the decisions made at this conference.
Well, that's absolutely correct. At the detail level, the way that this process works is there are really many things going on at the negotiation level. On the one hand, the individual nation states bring forward what is called a nationally determined commitment or nationally determined contribution, an NDC. Many of the nations of the world that are party to the Paris Agreement have indeed offered up greater and more ambition in their revised climate plan. President Biden announced an improved plan in the spring of this year at a global climate summit that he had in April. He called for the United States to be able to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030, a very, very aggressive role. Other nation states like Canada and the European Union have come forward with improved plans. But regrettably, many large emitters have not yet come forward with improved NDCs. So the outcome of COP26 will have us on the trajectory needed to meet these new goals is really unclear at this point. But there is room for ambition. There is room for hope that this moves forward. And the gathering begins this upcoming Sunday on October 31st.
I know there's going to be a lot of talk about money and climate justice at this conference. Basically, developing countries tend to pollute less per head of population and are not responsible for most of the emissions from the past. So wealthier countries that are further along and being an industrialized state have pledged $100 billion a year to help poorer nations. And that pledge was in place to be completed by 2020, but that target was missed. So at this conference, there's going to be a lot of conversation about that money.
You're absolutely right. That aspect of finance from the wealthier countries, particularly the group of 20, the G20 group, the industrialized nations of the work, is very important. That pledge of $100 billion per year was made several years ago. Under the Obama administration, the United States was able to move forward on a portion of its then modest pledge of $3 billion. It was subsequently blocked with further contributions under the Trump administration. But one of the breakthrough pieces of information that came out at the United Nations General Assembly gathering just a few weeks ago in New York City was that President Biden pledged $11 billion on an annual basis to be able to support this climate fund. It's important to understand as well, I believe, how this money will be used. Indeed, it is focused upon those developing countries who are most currently dealing with the ongoing impact of the climate crisis. It's easy for us to be able to think about the low-lying states in the Pacific. We can think of Fiji, or we can think of Tuvalu or Vanuatu. These small nation states that are built upon atolls or low-rising islands, and they are even today faced with the dramatic impact of the changes. It's a similar circumstance even here in the Western Hemisphere. We saw the dramatic impact of the hurricanes that struck in Guatemala just a few months ago. And we here in New Mexico need to understand these linkages. As climate chaos affects citizens in Central America and South America or in Haiti, we can anticipate that there will be an increased pressure for climate migration for those people who can no longer till the land and no longer sustain themselves. So these are not abstract issues. They have an impact upon us even on a daily basis here in New Mexico.
That's right. Did you see this list that just came out from I think it was on Yahoo News of the like top 10 cities to go to be safe from the climate crisis?
I did not. Were there any that came to mind for you?
Albuquerque is number 4 on the list.
Is that right?
Yeah. And I would think we're fairly high on the list because we're not close to the coast. We don't have to deal with extreme heat the same way they do in some places. Our major climate threats are drought, water scarcity here in the Southwest, being intensified by the changing climate. Forest fires and floods are really the big ones here, but compare that to being underwater on the coast or having to deal with extreme heat waves that lead to deaths from heat strokes and things like that. And we look pretty good in Santa Fe, but some places with more average annual precip might look a little better in terms of long-term sustainability. We can only support so many people here in the Southwest with the water that arrives in this part of the world even before the changing climate. So, in this world, in the sustainability work I do at the city, the people who do this around the country for different cities, through the past, a lot of our focus has been on reducing greenhouse gas emissions so that we can lessen the impact of the changing climate. But now we've had to shift the conversation more to reducing emissions and adapting and being resilient in the face of the changing climate. So, coming out of this conference, there's going to be a lot of conversation about protecting more people from those impacts of climate change, doing things like funding coastal defense systems to help protect people living along the coast from storm surges and high tides. I just want to make sure, the listeners who are tuning in right now, learning about COP26, just understand the breadth of this conference. There's expected to be 25,000 people there, including New Mexico delegation. Gary, you want to tell us about the Coalition of Sustainable Communities and its connection to the COP26?
Well, I can talk about actually 3 groups of people that I know are going over. They will be representing aspects of our climate action response here in the state of New Mexico. Leading the list is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. She will be going over to COP26, going into Glasgow, along with Secretary Kinney from the Environment Department, Secretary Probst from Energy, Minerals, Natural Resources Department, Secretary Keyes from Economic Development, and 2 additional staff persons within the administration. So they will be carrying their message across multiple presentation opportunities at COP26. They will not be formal negotiators per se. Those fall at the national level, but they will be able to tell the story of what the state has been doing with respect to fossil fuels, with respect to the ETA, with respect to community solar, with respect to methane rules, etc. Additionally, our Coalition of Sustainable Communities New Mexico is sending a delegation as well. It will be headed by Beth Beloff, our executive director, and the person who in the Santa Fe area led the effort for the Santa Fe Sustainability Plan that was adopted 2 years ago. Accompanying her as well will be Councilor Randall Wrighty, the chair and councilor of Los Alamos County. The third person in that coalition will be Mark Hayden as the state procurement officer from GSD. And the fourth person in that party will be Mark Geller, an attorney and financial advisor as well here in the local area. The third group that I'm aware of, and I add that there could well be additional New Mexicans that are traveling over, but I'm just highlighting those that I'm aware of and have interaction with right now, will be 4 persons who are traveling from the greater Santa Fe area. They have the opportunity to be able to share their message, particularly from a Dene perspective, and a perspective to give presentations on climate resolution. So I believe that given the population of our state, we will have the chance to be well represented. And as we think about the COP, let me turn as well to the kind of activity that can be expected by both the New Mexicans who are there as well as other global citizens who are present. On the one hand, the negotiations are conducted by representatives of nation states from around the world, but the supporting group around it can actually be huge. There will be representatives of non-governmental organizations, think tanks, scientific organizations that bring their expertise to bear. There will be a large presence of the business community, and it's important to underscore that at the action level, much of the mitigation, much of the resiliency comes through the action of business leaders who are setting new goals for how to be able to reduce emissions in their activity and to bring new technical solutions to the issue. And there will be indeed thousands and thousands of citizens representing the global community as well, be they climate activists, be they representatives of the faith community. So this is a swirl of humanity focused on the issue of how might nation states move better together to address these changes. The pressure is put upon the negotiators, and the goal is to be able to come through with plans that will improve the individual course of the nations and those engaged.
I'm really glad to hear we have this New Mexican delegation going because, in New Mexico, we know resilience well, and there are lots of things we can teach the international community about, facing challenging times and making it through. If you're just tuning in, this is Climate Matters, your monthly sustainability radio show brought to you by the City of Santa Fe Environmental Services Division. We are talking about COP26, which is starting on Halloween. And will last for 2 weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It's convened by the United Nations for world leaders and negotiators, journalists, citizens to all come together and reach agreements for how we're going to basically mitigate the impacts of climate change and shift the course of the international community to not have to deal with these scary climate threats. I'm talking with Gary Payton. He's the Research and Technical Advisor for the Coalition of Sustainable Communities New Mexico. And we were just talking about all the negotiations that are going to happen, the New Mexican delegation that's going to be there. And, Gary, we got to touch on something that's probably on everyone's minds, and, China's participation in this conference. I think many of the listeners know China is the world's biggest polluter. It has investments in coal stations, not just in China, but all over the world. So will Xi Jinping be at this conference?
On the day that we're recording this, I do not know that he has yet committed. So you bring up a very important point, because the way this process works is the senior leadership that is present often sets the tone of enthusiasm, of ambition, of urging their own negotiators on, even within the limits that they've been set with by their nation. As it happens, this conference will be preceded on Saturday, the 30th of October, by a gathering of the G20, these 20 most industrialized nations. And then that leadership, many of those senior leaders, presidents and prime ministers, will then fly to the UK to participate in the first hours of the COP itself. So we know that President Biden is going, but over the course of the last few days, it has been confirmed that President Putin of Russia will not attend. It is unclear whether President Xi Jinping from China will be present. It is unclear whether or not President Lopez Obrador of Mexico will be present. So, as a person in Paris in 2015, I will tell you that having that senior leadership present puts a spark into the enthusiasm. It sets goals that are important for the negotiators to follow. So this is a different environment. The organizers, both the United Nations organizers and the organizers from the UK, are clearly faced with the challenge that COVID has presented.
Right.
They will be, the people engaged will be involved with daily COVID testing. And while I gave mention to senior leaders of large nations, the travel restrictions are presenting challenges for small nations. There's much concern among, as an example, the Pacific Island states, that the logistics and the COVID restrictions and the travel challenges may limit the number of civil society people that can come from the developing countries around the world. So the gathering will have a different composition. It'll have a different flavor and mood than it did in 2015. But I remain hopeful that even if only small improvements, small changes can be made, that those will have a continuing positive impact on the path that we're trying to take to deal with the climate crisis.
Right. This is definitely challenging right in the middle of COVID. It's kind of interesting to find ourselves in these times where world leaders are trying to come together to avert us from the catastrophes posed by the changing climate when we're dealing with a global pandemic, a catastrophe in and of itself, making it hard for everyone to get together. But what you mentioned about Putin not being there, I thought I saw that he would attend at least virtually. So I know that's not quite the same, but at least it shows some interest.
That you are correct. I have seen that report that he will beam in where there are virtual opportunities, and that presentation will be important, because the ever growing concerns about methane release, both at the natural level from the melting permafrost in the northern regions of Russia, or their own very significant gas production, they become a significant contributor to methane that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Yeah, we end up talking about carbon dioxide a lot because that is the lion's share of the greenhouse gas emissions that are going up into the atmosphere. But yeah, methane is 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. When I say potent, I mean in terms of heat trapping. You know, when the heat from the sun comes down, bounces off the earth and goes up, basically those gases are making it so it doesn't keep going up, comes back down. That's the greenhouse effect in a nutshell. You know, and methane is coming from natural gas production, it's coming from landfills, it's coming from agriculture. But the carbon dioxide is largely coming from our tailpipes and from electricity production. So I think we talk about that more because it has a closer connection to our personal choices. And speaking about our personal choices, what are some things we'll see coming out of this conference? What are the actual implementations that will be discussed to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I think that there will be there are potential for several different actions. On the one hand, as we previously discussed, we're likely to see an improved financial commitment from some of the major nations of the world that can assist the developing nations in terms of adaptation. That will be an important aspect. There is conversation about greater definition to carbon market that might be implied in rules for how a carbon market might work globally and within regions around the world that could reduce potential emissions. The Paris Agreement called for a ratcheting, or if you will, a regular improvement and tightening of individual countries' national determined contributions, or if you will, their climate pledge. I think we're going to see, rather than these happening every 5 years or so, the enthusiasm, the intensity that is present right now may push the rule makers for the agreement to say the nations need to come back annually or need to come back every 2 years with improved plans. That will add emphasis and expand the possibility of nations and businesses to be able to do more. So these are all the kind of things that I think have the potential of coming out of the negotiation when it concludes on Friday, November 12th, or Saturday, November 13th.
And what sort of actions in those climate plans will affect people's lives? Like what sort? I think we'll be seeing a faster switch to electric cars.
We have all of these cascade down from the broad scale at the international level, and it's important to kind of understand how that cascading works. President Biden will be moving forward with the plans that are currently in Build Back Better, and it's my hope that the clean energy plan, as a part of this scheme that is currently in Congress, will be passed and will have those. It's an acceleration of charging stations. It's investment in automobile companies so that they have the ability to be able to transition more to electric vehicles. It provides incentives to power production facilities and potential financial pledges for not shifting swiftly enough to wind and solar. As I said, these things cascade, and then we look at what happens at the state level. New Mexico has been noted in the last 3 years for its major steps in improving climate action. We can anticipate more improvement even in the upcoming January session of the New Mexico legislature. And then we have responsibilities at the city level, at the county level, and at the individual level. So all of these work together. They're interconnected. I kind of think of them as Russian stack dolls, if you will, each sitting inside the other. But it's the combination of what happens at the national level, the business level, the NGO faith community level, and the subnational level of counties and cities and our individual responsibilities. All of that together can produce some degree of progress toward averting the worst scenarios of the oncoming climate crisis.
I like that Russian doll analogy. Very well put, Gary. Well, this has been Climate Matters, your monthly sustainability show brought to you by the City of Santa Fe Environmental Services Division. We are on KSWV Radio every fourth Wednesday from 8:30 to 9. So we'll be back on November 24th with a discussion about sustainability over the holidays. So tune in then, 8:30 to 9, and you can always find a video recording of our shows on the City of Santa Fe Environmental Services website. Thank you so much for being my guest, Gary.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share, Neil.
All right, you have a nice day.